Thank you. Welcome everyone as you're coming in, and welcome to the day 3 of our 1-week virtual Insect University. Glad you could join us this morning. We're just gathering. If you've been here other days, you already know we have a Q&A box. That's where we'll be taking your questions. We'll save those for the end for Olivia. And we also have a chat box, so you can open that up on your screen as well. We'll get started in just a few minutes. So again, welcome folks. We'll start in just a minute or two. It's Denise Ellsworth. I'm with the OSU Department of Entomology, and welcome to day 3 of our 1-week virtual Insect University. I'll introduce our speaker in just a few minutes, but we are going to use the Q&A box for questions. So if you want to open that up on your Zoom tab, so that's handy. And we can also use the chat box if you have questions or concerns for procedural things that you need the moderators to weigh in on. All right, well, I show 10 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started this morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Denise Ellsworth with the OSU Department of Entomology, based out of Worcester, Ohio. But we have actually folks joining us every morning this week for our 1-week Insect University from all over. So welcome wherever you're from. If this is day 3 from you, this is all familiar to you. If you're new today, welcome. We're going to use the Q&A box for questions, and we'll save those questions for Olivia. We'll field those at the end. There's also a chat box, so if you have procedural questions, for some reason you can't hear something, you can put issues in the chat box and our moderators will try to help you out with those. I do want to recognize Marcia Karsten and Julia Wilson. Marcia's helping to moderate this session. She's one of our OSU pollinator specialists and also a Xerces pollinator ambassador. Julia Wilson is a program director at Chadwick Arboretum, and so the Department of Entomology and Chadwick are cooperating on this week's virtual Insect University. So thanks, Julia, for joining us as well. I do want to recognize our funders who are helping make this program free for all of you. We have funding from the USDA NIFA Integrated Pest Management Pollinator Health Grant, and also the Manitou Fund. So our thanks to those groups for helping us put on this program. So I want to just highlight a few things about the 1-week program. We do have a web page for links and follow-up resources. If you've been here this week, this is already familiar to you. It's the go.osu.edu/InsectU, and we'll put that link in the chat box too, so it's live and handy. And what we've done is link to resources. Here's yesterday's speaker, Heather Holm, and we've linked to lots of sources that she mentioned, books from her website, some interviews with Heather, and some of the organizations that she talked about. And so we'll do the same thing after our talk today. If there are updates, we'll add those to Olivia's section. And to help us improve what we do here, if you could rate today's webinar, I'll put that link in at the end as well, but there's a quick link, rate InsectU. And if you evaluate today's program, you'll be put in the hopper to be possibly drawn to win a book. So we have some winners from yesterday's drawing: Laura W., Amy H., Lou, Judy, and Renee. So congratulations to all of you. They got to pick out a book of their choosing. So today's feature book is, of course, The Bees in Your Backyard, a book that our speaker, Olivia Carril, co-authored with Joe Wilson. And Olivia and Joe have a new book coming out. It's specific for bees of the East, due in 2021. So there's a lot of excitement about that book coming out. Olivia and I first met about 4 or 5 years ago. She came to Ohio for a workshop down in Southern Ohio, and we love Olivia, and she really has adopted Ohio as maybe her second or third state home, beside underneath New Mexico, where she lives, and Utah, where she grew up. But we try to bring Olivia back every year, feature her in a number of workshops and ID sessions across the state. Of course, we couldn't do that this year, but are really excited to have Olivia here to share her knowledge with us. She's been working with bees for the last 20 years, and she'll talk a little bit about how she came into the world of bees, but a wonderful resource and an excellent educator. So Olivia, welcome. Thanks so much for coming to today's session, talking about dreaming of world bees. I have to tell you that, Olivia, when you told me your title, when you sent it to me in an email, I didn't quite get it at first. It took me a minute. I had to say it out loud. Oh, dreaming of world bees. So I'll turn the podium over to you. Thanks and welcome, Olivia.
Thanks, Denise. It's always fun to talk with you and all of the people that are showing up. 250 people today is pretty good. I think, let's see, this will stop others sharing screen. There we go. Okay. Let me share my screen here. When I first came up with this title, my young daughter, who I ran it by, said that she thought it sounded like dreaming of whirled peas. So maybe it wasn't the best title, but there it is. So I'll just jump right in. And I thought that, you know, I know you guys, many of you are fairly familiar with pollinators and bees, and maybe don't need the overview that you already have. So we're going to jump right in, but I wanted to make sure that we started at the beginning. So we're going to go back in time to the time of the dinosaurs, maybe 120 million years ago, when dinosaurs, and I teach about this every year. I teach 7th and 8th grade and 6th grade, and of course dinosaurs come up. So these images are in my head a lot, thinking about them tromping across the earth. But underneath them would have been these cute, adorable, tiny flowers. Our first flowers probably appeared maybe right around 120 million years ago, give or take. And they had these tiny, tiny little flowers. But by about 100 million years ago, 20 million years after flowers first appeared, they had evolved to have rather large central sort of discs with pollen and nectar. They're centrally located. And at the same time that these plants are sort of evolving into the many different shapes that we see today, another group of organisms was also evolving into something more similar to what we see today. And that, of course, is the wasps. Wasps were flying at the same time that these dinosaurs and early flowers were around. And the wasps that chose to visit these flowers and to become permanently and for the duration of the future attached to these flowers were the ones that we now call the bees. And this came across my feed last week, and I thought it was pretty funny. It kind of sums up the relationship between the bees and the flowers that rely on them. And that relationship is actually a pretty good thing for both of them, even though there's a bit of a give and a take and a, you know, this this poll over pollen and where it should go and how it should be used, it has nonetheless led to the incredible diversity in bees, not wasps, but the group of wasps that is today's bees around the world. And so I wanted to celebrate these today. I thought it might be fun and a little bit different than some of the other stuff that you've been learning. So I'm going to begin by just talking about some really cool, really interesting bees, species, and genera that we can see in different parts of the world. But then we'll come back and talk about, now that we know and appreciate and love these creatures around the world, what sort of threats are they facing and what might we be able to do to help them? So here's the world and kind of highlighting the different ecoregions. And if we look, I pulled this up from Discover Life. They have a list of bee species by country. And obviously it's not completely accurate because there are parts of the world where either for political reasons it's too dangerous to really visit, or there's never really been a focus there. But it still gives a sense of sort of the trends that we see in bee species richness around the world. And what you can see is that obviously the bigger a country is, the more species there are. So for example, the United States kind of takes the cake there with over 3,500. It's also a really large country. But one of the interesting things to note with this and to remember is that it doesn't have to be that bee species richness goes up as you increase area. So the underlying message when you see that there are more species as you add area, what you're really saying is that the bee species change across a landscape. So when you add more area, you're adding a new suite of bees. So there's a lot of what we call spatial turnover. So there are pockets of different kinds of bees as you move across a larger and larger landscape. So kind of an interesting little side piece there. So what we see are, of course, places like the US is quite high. We're at just the right latitude. We have a huge diversity of different kinds of ecoregions. But generally speaking, if you eliminate that area factor, you find that the countries that are in Mediterranean climates, so here Turkey, Greece, Italy, Spain, even France, are quite high for bee species richness. South Africa, which has again that Mediterranean vibe, and then similar reasons over here in South America and Australia. So xeric and desert regions are where we find our greatest bee species richness. Let's zoom in on just the US just for a minute here. And this is by ecoregion. So if you take the major ecoregions of the United States, things like eastern deciduous forests, boreal forests, Sonoran Desert, Chihuahuan Desert, Mojave Desert, Great Basin, Colorado Plateau, etc. You find that the greatest number of genera is the plural for genus. So things like Osmia, Anthidium, Apis, Bombus, Xylocopa, those sorts of words are at the genus level. If you look at those, there's somewhere between 90 and 100 different genera in these hot desert regions, the Chihuahuan and Sonoran Desert throughout Mexico and just into the southern US are great places to find a lot of different kinds of bees at the larger level. If we were to instead do the same thing but look at species, we find that the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin, that sort of weird deserty region that exists between maybe like Salt Lake City and Reno, Nevada, that sort of area in there has a lot of species. Not so many genera, which means each one of those has a lot of species in it, right? So like Anthidium, the wool carder bees, there's an insane number of them that occur in that Great Basin region. And so that drives the species number up, even though they're all more closely related to each other. So what this is showing is that even when you zoom in on one country, there are places within that country where most of the bees are probably concentrated, and it's likely the drier or Mediterranean regions, as you can see from this map that we have created here. Okay, so let's talk about some of these really cool bees now that we know where we might be looking for the really interesting ones. This one is phenomenal. Man, before I die, I want to see this thing in person in my net. I'll let it go. I just want to see it. I just want to see it wiggling around. This is called Rediviva, and it's a specialist on this beautiful plant here. And what they do is, can you see that there's these long corolla tubes on the back? You can actually get this thing and plant it in your yard. And those long spurs have floral oils in them. So this is a bee that, in addition to the pollen and nectar that it needs, also supplements its offspring with oil. And so it takes those long, long front legs, females only, they're the ones with the long legs. And I don't know if you could tell, but those front legs actually have some really interesting little hairs on them that they use to sop up the oil. And they'll stick them down into that flower. You might be able to see that in this one picture here. She's taking her long front legs and sticking them down in there and sopping up the oil that's in there and pulling it out to take back, which is just, it's kind of cool. It's amazing. Here's another one. We have carpenter bees, but we don't have carpenter bees like this. Xylocopa cerulean, and this one is found in Southeast Asia. It's fairly widespread. It's not by any means a rare bee, and nests in wood just the same as it does here, of course, and just really, really neat. It's about almost an inch long, not quite, but close to an inch long. If you hold a ruler up, we're like 0.9 inches long. I had to put in the largest bee in the world. This is an important one to include. This is Megachile Pluto. It was collected over 100 years ago by some of the early explorers that visited Indonesia and that area. And then it wasn't seen for a really long time. Specimens were found in the 1980s again. And then about, 3 years ago, 2 specimens were found, 2 living creatures were found, which was very exciting. They were immediately killed and sold on eBay, of all things, which just goes to show pollinators maybe aren't on the forefront of everyone's mind as something that we should be conserving and being careful with. But the next year, this really cool guy, you might have heard of Clay Bolt, went back down there and actually filmed it, got video of it, which is pretty neat, and then let it go. So it's still persisting, but it appears to be fairly rare. It nests in wood, and the female of this thing is about twice the size of our carpenter bees. So it's just under 2 inches in size. The wingspan is about 2 inches. The length of it is a little bit less than that. Maybe like 1.7 inches long or something. The males are smaller. They're about the size of our carpenter bees. So there's this big difference in the size of the males versus the females, but still just a really cool bee. Another one I'd love to see. I may have to do like a world trip, just traveling the world trying to see these bees. This one's more common. This is a European bee, Osmia bicolor. And I just, what's really cool about this bee, other than the fact that it's so striking to look at, we have bees that striking here too, let's be honest. But these nest in snail shells. They're called helicophiles, and they're among a large group of bees, mostly in the mason bee-ish sort of group, that choose to nest inside snail shells. So we find this all over the place. It's kind of neat, but Osmia bicolor is one that does that. I wanted to put this in just because it's kind of interesting to see bees that fly at dusk and dawn. So this one's called Megalopta. This is a beautiful picture taken by Sam Drogi's lab. If you haven't checked out his Flickr site, I highly recommend it because he has stunning images of bees. And this one flies at dusk, and you can see on the top of the head, you may be aware that bees have the 2 compound eyes, but in between them in the center are these simple eyes. But on these guys, they're huge. They're really enlarged, really, really large eyes there. And this is an adaptation to flying when there's very little light, when it's really hard to see. And my assumption for a long time was that this had to do with maybe an adaptation to visit flowers that were blooming at dusk and dawn. But it turns out they'll visit pretty much any flower that happens to be open then. They're not very particular about it. And the thought is that they're actually, it's an adaptation to flying at the time when there's the least number of predators that might sneak into their nest. So right at dusk and dawn, probably not too many creatures that would be trying to get into their nest. So it's a good time for mom to sneak out, grab some pollen, and get back before any of the many predators to their nests would occur. I should mention this thing is in like the Panama area, so like southern Central America, which is an area with a lot of ants, and many of those ants like to sneak into bee nests. So that's the thought there. I have to mention Trigona, and not all Trigona do this, but there are 3 species of Trigona that we know of that are carrion eaters. So some people call them vulture bees for that reason, but they're social, and they actually will get pieces of meat and partially digest it and haul it back to the nest, where they'll give it to a worker bee who will finish digesting it and turning that little piece of meat into something resembling the honey that we get from our honeybees, but made in a much different way, which is kind of amazing. And then this, so now finally to one that we find locally. This is amazing. This is Macrotera portalis, named after the place where we find it. This bee is amazing for a couple different reasons. One of my favorites, because I live in the deserts and I think about desert environments a lot. Macrotera portalis is one of those tiny, tiny little bees that seems to be very good at bet hedging, which means that in a given year, if the conditions don't seem right, the little larvae, the pupa that are in the ground, getting ready to emerge and visit flowers for that year, may choose to wait in the ground for an additional year before they come up if it seems like floral conditions aren't just right. So pretty amazing, number one, that it can sort of do that. But number two, this is a male, and I don't know if you can tell, the head on this thing is huge. It has this really big head with these strange mandibles. Even weirder than that is the fact that not all of the males have heads like this. So there's actually two kinds of males that occur in the same vicinity. The ones with the giant heads actually can't fly. Their flight muscles have atrophied to the point that they can't really fly very well. And so they stay in the nest where they were born. And they fight in there. They use their mandibles to sort of fight with each other, which would be cool to see. And mate with whoever goes into that nest. So the nest gets reused for several years in a row, and these bees are probably mating with relatives, so to speak. The other kind, and this isn't a picture of it, this is actually a female, but I couldn't find a picture of the small-headed male to really show you. But it's more similar to this, just slightly smaller. It doesn't have those strange mandibles on the front. And that little bee flies out to flowers. That male morph, that male form, flies out to flowers and mates with whatever females it finds out there. This is the extent of our knowledge on this. We know that the female, based on what kind of food and how much food she gives to her offspring, can determine whether it's going to be the male with the giant head or the one with the small head that's going to leave the nest and go find females from other nests to mate with. And the reason why she would have, why this happens is a mystery still to be solved. So much to learn for us scientists. This is another one that can occur in Florida. It occurs a little bit into the US. It's more common just a little further south down in Central America. This is a euglossa, oftentimes called an orchid bee. And this is a male. I can tell by the yellow that's on the face most predominantly. That's the easiest thing. And if you look at the legs on the males, it's the coolest thing. They actually have like a little, like a satchel, like a purse that they can fill full of floral scent molecules. So they pick floral scent molecules that most appeal to them, and they pack them into this structure on their back legs, and then they land on a twig and stick their legs out and fan with their wings to blow those scent molecules off, up and out of their legs into the atmosphere. And this is their way of attracting females and finding females to mate with. The females are drawn to the floral scent, mating occurs. Pretty amazing. Bees are amazing. I haven't even told you about the ones with the giant red eyes, or the ones that nest in old lava tubes, or I don't know, the ones that nest in sort of a soupy mass of nectar with just a tiny bit of pollen. There are bees that make pollen balls that aren't balls, they're perfect cubes. There's so much diversity in what these bees do. It's kind of amazing and worth celebrating and worth appreciating, which makes it an important question to make sure that these incredible creatures are doing okay. Are our bees doing okay? I'm asked this question a lot, and it's always a hard one for me because I feel guilty not being able to give this one giant answer that satisfies everybody. The truth is, we're figuring it out. We don't know. We know some things, but there's a lot that we still don't know. So I want to walk you through some of what we do know, where current research is on some of these things, and then take any questions you might have and offer just a few suggestions. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of science papers that have been published in the last 20 years or so. Most of them are a little more recent than that. And I'll start with this one because I think it's fairly telling. It actually quantifies some of the bee changes that we've seen, and it focuses just on bumblebees. They didn't look at all of the bumblebees. There wasn't enough data for many of them, but they have a really great data set to kind of dive into this issue. And they looked at where these bees had been found historically and did this massive sampling trip pulled records from databases all over everywhere to look at where those bees are now, to figure out which of our bumblebees seem to be changing in terms of the range, how the geographic range of them, and also the abundance when they're found. And I'll just pulled a couple quotes directly from this. We show that the relative abundance of 4 species has declined by up to 96%. So that's pretty dramatic. That's a pretty big change. And what's more, in addition to that, where they occur is much smaller than it was 20 years ago. Interestingly, they also had a mechanism. They seem to have an idea for why, a potential mechanism for why this might be happening. Declining populations have significantly higher levels of some of the pathogens and the parasites that really affect these bees, and also lower genetic diversity compared to co-occurring populations that were stable. So that's interesting. That's really interesting. So here is also from theirs. We can dive in here and look. The species that they indicated to be in decline in the West included Bombus occidentalis and Bombus terricola. Whereas in the East, and you guys are probably aware of this, Bombus pennsylvanicus and Bombus affinis appear to be in decline, and they have pretty good data to show that. They also found several species that were increasing, that were becoming more abundant. So we can start thinking of these, and I'm going to use these phrases again. In any situation, there's likely to be winners and losers, and they were able to identify a few that might be winners and a few that are maybe losing. Bombus bifarius and Bombus vosnesensky seem to be more common than they used to be, whereas Bombus bimac and Bombus impatiens are also becoming more common, more abundant. So that's I think a really solid paper with actual numbers to kind of indicate those. There's a nice paper that came out a little more recently. That one's a little older now. And in this one, they focused on just one area in northeastern North America, and they looked to see how bumblebee populations were changing in this region of New Hampshire, because they have a really good data set up there that spans 120, 150 years. And in addition to just looking at how the bumblebee populations had changed, they also looked to see if they could tie this to any changes in the floral records. So here's what they found. Here's maps for New Hampshire. They found major changes in Bombus affinis, Bombus fervidus, and Bombus terricola. And I've put up the Bombus terricola one here, and possibly significant declines in Bombus vagans. Interestingly, there's still bumblebees in the places where Bombus vagans used to be. It's not that there's no bumblebees there anymore. It's just that which one it is has changed. So now impatiens is in the areas where they used to find Bombus vagans. Bombus terricola is now found mostly at higher elevations and not down in the lower elevations, nor near the more urban environments that have cropped up in the last 150 years. Here's another one. This is so there are many angles, there are many ways to try and get at this idea of bee declines. Bumblebee declines, focusing on one species, is one way to do it. Another is to look and see if we can see any changes in the sort of the connectedness and how these bees are interacting with their flowers. So here, 3 scientists, 2 of them spent a good period of time going back out into the field. And what they did is they went to an area where a guy named Charles Robertson had been collecting bees and recording amazing records, these records of what flowers those bees were visiting 120 some years ago, 130 almost years ago. And we have this great data set of what flowers bees were visiting way back then. And so now we can revisit those sites and see if bees are on those same flowers. So they focused on 26 of those flowers, and here's what they created. Crazy complicated to look at, but it's really not too bad. I'll walk you through it here. On the left side, these are the names of different flowers here. And on the right side are the names of bees that historically, when Charles Robertson was doing his work, or today, were collected. So they found these bees visiting these flowers. And every time there's a line, it indicates a connection between the two. If the line is black, it means that 130 years ago, there was a connection, and even now there's still a connection. So that connection hasn't really changed. The bee is still visiting the same flower it was over a century ago. The lines that are in red are a connection that they found in the past. So these bees were visiting these flowers many years ago and aren't visiting those flowers now. And the lines in blue also indicate changes, but not necessarily because the bee isn't there anymore, maybe more because of some other change in the landscape. Maybe the timing was off, maybe the location of the bee with the flower that they were studying might have changed somewhat. And so here's how they sum it up. Only 24% of those original linkages persisted, but interestingly, they found several new interactions happening between bees and plants that weren't happening a century ago. They found about 109 bee species, which is pretty interesting, but they say that 407 of the 532 interactions from 120 years ago were not found. And they point out that every single one of the flowers that Charles Robertson collected on are still there. The change is the bees. The bees are not there anymore. I want to point out, and they did in their paper, a couple things that are worth at least keeping in mind here, because I don't think it's quite as dramatic as they make it out to be. Many of the connections that they failed to find had to do with parasitic bees, kleptoparasites, that sneak into the nest of a normal host bee and lay an egg in there, kind of like a cuckoo bird would, same idea, and then fly out and leave that little offspring to grow up on the pollen of a different bee. So they don't actually care where they're getting their pollen from so much, in the same sense that some of these other bees, and tend to be found on a wide variety of flowers. I notice in their data set that the bees so the nomata that I see here, all of these are kleptoparasites that actually the host bee that they tend to be attracted to are still there. So are these truly gone, or is it just that they're visiting maybe dandelions or some other flower that they weren't looking at that's now more abundant in the landscape than it was back then? Because they only focused on those 26 plants, we don't know what else was happening with some of these generalist bees in the area as invasive plants or some other resource came in and took its place. I also noticed on their list a couple of specialist bees, things like the southeastern blueberry bee, but the plant that bee specializes on wasn't sampled. So the fact that those connections aren't there maybe isn't quite as alarming to me, and is a little bit of a relief. The other part of this is we really don't know how much time Robertson spent working on this project. I mean, he was very diligent and took a lot of time sort of taking notes, but how much sampling he did compared to how much sampling was done 120 years later is a big unknown that might make it a little more difficult to really get an exact answer on how much things have changed. This is another great paper that came out, 9 years ago, something like that, that asks which bees that used to be in the eastern US are still there. So they compiled together, and I have it here, all of the databases that they could across the US. They had millions and millions of records to pick from. And they looked at all of these records and kind of divided up their data as before 1990 and after. And all they looked at really was presence and absence. So was the bee there before 1990, and is the bee there after? And if it was, that suggests the bee is, still present. It's still present on this landscape. They found that of the 770 bees historically associated with Eastern North America, 95 of them were there before 1990, 95% of them were there before and after 1990. There were a few that they didn't find, but most of those seemed to be sort of on the edge of their range and mostly associated with sort of Midwest rather than true Eastern North America. And it could be that they sort of flit in and out and are less commonly associated with these different areas. This study, I should point out, because it's just presence absence and not number of individuals, is what we would call more of a qualitative study. There are no quantities here in the true sense. And so for that reason, if Bombus affinis was present with 1,500 individuals and is now present with only 30, it would be recorded as present before and after, and the details of that major decline isn't really obvious from their data. Still a really interesting study. Okay, and then one last one about bee declines, and there have been a couple fairly recently that kind of highlight and reinforce what I'm showing here that we could talk about too. But generally speaking, what we're finding in science, we seem to be finding again and again for these bees. Bumblebees have been the best studied, and so there's several studies on them that we can look at. So these guys, I really like this one. They compiled bee records again from institutions in the Northeast. Apparently that's where all bee research was done a while back. And they looked at 438 bee species, looking for declines. And what they found was, you know, some bees maybe a little bit declining. There were a few that seemed pretty obvious. Most of those were bumblebees, but a few others that maybe were slightly declining. Hard to say for sure how significant it was. But when they've pulled back a little bit to a different sort of scale and looked at instead at what kinds of bees might be having shifts in how abundant they were, they found that specialist bees, bees that fly for shorter periods of time, and bees with larger body size were the ones most likely to have shifted in terms of their abundance and richness over the last 100 years. Pretty interesting. So maybe we should be focusing, instead of on specific species, maybe on groups that are more sensitive or less sensitive than others. So to sum up, there are going to be winners and losers. When we're talking about bee declines, some bees are probably doing great. We could think of them as the weed bees, the bees that like some of those plants that seem to do well no matter what. And some that seem more sensitive to the changes that are happening right now on the earth. A few bombus species are becoming more abundant, but a few are also declining very, very significantly. Bee communities have changed in composition, and it seems that they're visiting different flowers than they were historically. Is this a natural thing that happens in bee communities? I mean, even in a natural environment where we see these sorts of shifts, we don't know yet for sure, but nonetheless, those changes are apparent. And it seems to be that how those communities have changed in composition might be tied to which flowers they're visiting. And truthfully, I think the final bit here is we don't really have much in the way of quantitative data to really say this bee has declined by 50% in the last 30 years. We're still working on that. So what do we do about this lack of data, especially moving forward when we want answers now, but we don't have that historical data to really compare present day populations to see? Well, we can get creative. There's lots of different ways that we could analyze this. We could look at changes in genetic diversity and see what that might tell us about populations expanding or contracting. Is there something we haven't looked at in the many bee collections that occur across this country that we could use? Maybe the pollen on bee legs can help us understand how floral visitation has changed over the last 50 years. Are there other methods of analyzing data that we haven't really thought of yet that we could use here? And can we standardize and work in a more cooperative way across states or across land agencies to answer some of these questions so that the data isn't sort of isolated from each other in different areas? Is there a way to involve citizen scientists a little more? Is there a way to really utilize the great passion that there is for our native bees right now and answer this question in some other ways? And can we find maybe one bee? Some people have even suggested the honeybee. If the honeybee's in decline, doesn't that tell us that all the others must be too? Is there a way to either focus at the level of the guild or some sort of other group instead of focusing on individual bees? And for me, the main focus of a lot of my work over the last little bit has been to try and quantify bee populations over time. So I spend my summers out working a lot in standardized plots that I've set up that have been collected in the same way for the last 4 to 20 years. And I can revisit those now and see if there are any changes in sort of bee population dynamics across time. And of course, I take all of my specimens and I pin them up, and then I have to go to the great trouble of identifying all of them. And this is another major problem, is that there aren't many people out there that can identify to the species level the 3,600 different species that are in North America. And so there can be a bit of a bottleneck there. I love this. This is one of my bee heroes. He actually was in New Mexico and did a lot of his work here at the turn of the the 19th century, a long time ago. And he said, there's no doubt that bees, from the number of species, the ease with which they are collected, it's true, and the restricted distribution of many, afford excellent materials for defining zoological regions and life zones. Like, these are worth studying, is his point here. That they have not been used to any extent for such purposes must be explained by the inadequacy of existing collections and records, and especially the difficulty of determining species. He said this 114 years ago, and I would say nothing's really changed. We're in the same place that we were way back then, still trying to figure out which species there are and trying to fill in those holes in our collection. So how do we do this, and where should we be focusing our efforts? Well, one way to do this would be to think about, based on what we understand about bees and sort of this our general understanding of bee biology, even without those specifics, where should we focus our efforts? What threats do we think bees are most likely to face? We can start with climate change. That's one thing that's on the minds of anybody studying natural ecosystems right now. And I don't have a total answer here, obviously, but I can walk you through a few of the studies that have been done that have hinted at what we might know. This one is the most recent. This paper came out earlier this year, right before coronavirus hit us, and we kind of stopped thinking about these things. And this is, he spends most of his time modeling data. The people who wrote this study are most known for their ability to take massive data sets and compile them and sort of try and predict the future based on what they find. And bumblebees seem like something that he could try and model based on the data that was available. And what he says is that overall rates of climate change related extirpation among species greatly exceed those of colonization. So bees are leaving the landscape, bumblebees in particular, they are moving on to it and contributing to pronounced bumblebee species declines across both Europe and North America. And he mentions that the consequences, we don't know. We don't know what this means for us on this planet. He has some beautiful graphics. He worked really hard on this. I would make the argument that the one flaw in this is lumping all of the bumblebees together as one thing. Kind of loses some of the specificity that we can associate with bumblebees. And he mentions in there as well that agricultural intensification is something that really should be looked at in conjunction with this, and that some of what he's seeing may have something to do also with changes in how the land has been used. And I think those are important things to keep in mind. His data isn't necessarily the end all of understanding the effect of climate change, even on just our bumblebees. So other papers that have really looked at this include some wonderful work that's been done up in the Rocky Mountains at really high elevations, again, focused on bumblebees, partly because bumblebees live together in these colonies. They're sometimes a little bit easier to really get a feel for than our solitary bees, which can butt hedge, which do all of these other strange things, and it's a little harder to really quantify them. Bumblebees are slightly more manageable in that sense. So they went up to some really high elevation stuff, and they had these hypotheses that over time they should see sort of this flowers and bees probably will stop emerging at the same time. There should be some asynchrony so that the flowers are either coming out earlier and the bees are missing the window of opportunity to visit those flowers, or vice versa. The bees are coming out too early and their flowers aren't there. So it's this asynchronous. They found some evidence of this for sure, not quite in the way that they thought. They had thought that perhaps the bumblebees would move up the hillside in elevation, and they didn't really find that. They seemed to be staying put in terms of where they were found, but there was some slight shift in the flower phenology and the bee phenology so that they weren't quite in sync. Remember too that bumblebees are generalist bees that visit a wide variety of flowers. So who between the bees and the flowers they visit would be most impacted by that asynchrony remains to be seen. Another paper that came out fairly recently, and I thought this was so fascinating. They looked at a whole bunch of different kinds of bees and checked whether how they overwinter and what time of year they emerge might differ depending on the bee they are and how they would change as temperatures change across the US. And they found that some bees seem to be able to continue to emerge when they should and don't seem to be as affected, whereas other bees that overwinter in different stages might be more affected by earlier springs. And then one final paper just to point out here. These guys say, don't forget to think about this in terms of other things that are happening on the landscape as well. So climate change doesn't act in isolation. It actually causes other changes that also could be affecting the bees, including things like invasive species that are coming in, and how might those be, invasive species might be more successful in climate change sort of scenario, and how does that affect our bees as well. All of which is to say, we still have a lot of work here to do. We still have a lot of things that we're trying to figure out. And remember too, that the answer for one ecoregion isn't going to be the same as it is for another. And so here was a paper that came out not that long ago that kind of indicated that maybe tropical and subtropical zones might see the biggest change in terms of the vegetation and what's going on there. And if that's the case, perhaps our bees that are in desert environments and Mediterranean environments would be less likely to notice, and maybe the bees most impacted are ones that are in the more sensitive environments. So our data hints at winners and losers. It's still to be determined who all is winning and who all is losing. And we need to keep in mind that thinking about the bee by itself maybe masks half of the issue that needs to be talked about here. Winners and losers are determined by location and also by floral preferences. So associated with climate change, of course, is this idea of wildfires. And this is something that comes up in my house a lot because my husband deals with wildfires quite a bit. And I can tell you that he talks about this all the time. And one of the things that he mentions is that there are two sort of competing things that have caused wildfires to be what they are. One, of course, is climate change, which means there have been these longer windows of time every year when fires can happen, but also that when those fires happen, because there is so much undergrowth that hasn't burned for 100 and some odd years, there's more of a chance of a really large, very destructive stand replacing fire, high intensity, that lasts on the landscape for more than just the brief time that it used to. So in many of our forests where these fires are happening, it used to be more of a mosaic where you'd have a small patch here, the next year a small patch of fire here, sort of this mosaic effect happening where everything was in a different stage of regrowth after the last fire. Now we have these huge, massive ones. They had one in Colorado that was, I don't know, last that I heard, over 300 square miles, and there were two that were about to come together. It burned for, let's see, August 16th, almost 2 months, I think, before it finally went out. And in cases like that, you know, we've created a vast sort of moonscape that's a little bit different than what we would have historically seen in terms of the patchiness, but also in terms of tree mortality. There was more of a chance for some of the trees at least to survive, maybe some riparian corridors to have remained untouched because the fire wasn't as intense or severe when it came through. I love this paper. This one came out not too many years ago. I say that, I feel old when I say that. I should be careful. And they kind of looked, all right, so let's see, how would bees be affected by the heat from a wildfire? Let's look at ground nesting bees and see if they can survive heating up the earth to some higher temperature, and for how long? Because they thought, you know, if the fire moves through quickly, as they used to typically do, maybe the bees in the ground won't really notice. And they found that with the exception of bees that nest very shallowly, most bees were able to survive the range of temperatures that soils usually get to when a surface fire moves through rather quickly. So ground nesting bees appear to be able to handle some heat added from a fire that moves quickly through. If the heat was sustained and lasted for quite a while, that effect kind of went away. These guys, I'll just read you the last sentence here. We hypothesize that pollinators increase after fire and during the early post-fire succession stages. However, high fire frequency has the opposite effect. So how frequently an area burns can also really change how the fire might affect the pollinators that are there. I would argue that in most of our landscapes where fire is a predominant factor in maybe shaping the whole structure of the forest, the understory and the overstory, chances are good that whatever pollinators occur there have some adaptations to it. And they found that around the world, this tends to hold true. Bees have some adaptations. Pollinators are in some cases able to handle some of the fire that comes through. Cavity nesting bees seem to do well. There's a whole bunch of wood right after a fire, and if there's pieces that aren't too terribly charred, they can survive. Of course, the twig nesting bees, any twig nesting bees in there might be differentially affected compared to those ones nesting in pieces of wood. And the other thing to think about is what's coming back after that fire. How do the plants survive these different severities of fire? And might they do better? Might the plants that the bees rely on afterwards be an important component in this as well? These guys looked at a couple of different plants after a fire had come through and found that some of them had great regeneration and actually did quite well, while the other ones had complete mortality and would need to be immigrate back into that area and sort of reseed from a population close by. So that makes the argument for more of a mosaic in the fire world. And then, of course, you end up with examples like this. This used to be called dicentric chrysanthemum. It occurs in California. They've renamed it again. Arendorferia chrysanthemum is this wonderful fire-following plant that occurs out there in the chaparral and has a bee. That bee only visits this flower. It is a specialist on dicentra, on Arendorferia. And somehow the two manage to coincide and keep following these fires as these patches of fire occur throughout chaparral areas. So that's kind of fascinating to think about, that there may be more adaptations to fire than we're aware. So again, data hints at winners and losers. It always will. To be determined who is winning and who is losing. There are probably more losers in a situation where the fire is severe and stand replacing, meaning that the whole stand of trees is replaced, is gone, and has to be regenerated from outside parent trees. And it's more likely to negatively impact the native bees. In that cases, the larger the fire and the longer it takes for the bees to come back in those areas. Another major issue that we talk about a lot these days is pesticide use. So here's just a little bit of information that's come for this fairly recently. And I tried to stick to the stuff that talks mostly about our native bees. There's a lot more information about this with honeybees. This paper came out very recently, for real this time, like January, like just barely. Is that just barely? It's almost over the year. Oh my goodness. And they found that areas where a field had been sprayed with neonics, there were less native bees in the soils around. So it may affect the soils and influence how many native bees can live in the areas surrounding even a crop, not necessarily the crop itself. There seem to be effects also around the world with this. And they found that depending on how a country sort of handles their use of pesticides, we may find different responses. They looked at both a bumblebee and a native bee and found significant decreases in the amount of offspring that were produced for the next year, depending on the concentration of neonics that were sprayed in the area. Here's another one that found that this was really interesting. I think this is my favorite of the lot that I pulled together here. While native bees were definitely impacted by pesticides, that could be buffered if the area around them had more native vegetation. And moreover, they found that there may be an impact of fungicides on these bees, which I find fascinating to think about, because I know that the fungal component of a lot of those pollens is big and maybe very important to the health of the bees. So spraying things that are, like a fungicide, we don't really think of as being something that should affect our bees, but it may be that in fact it has as much of an impact as some of those other more standard pesticides that we think about. But the presence of native vegetation around it may buffer, and the reason for that may be because it provides more of a resource base for these native bees that come in, they visit the apple trees a little bit, and then they go back to some other rows and maybe aren't getting quite the concentration of pesticide infected pollen into their nests. So the impact of pesticides can be buffered by other practices, including whether you use fungicides in conjunction with other pesticides and the amount of natural habitat around the area which has been sprayed. And the final one that I'll talk about here, and there's a little more data on this, but the data is also a little wonkier. It seems to vary a lot. Habitat removal and fragmentation. So let's look at a couple of papers here that have talked about this over the last 20 years. This wonderful paper looked just at bees on creosote plants, and the creosote plants were scattered around the Arizona desert, and some of them were in larger fragments and smaller fragments, and they looked to see how that might impact bees. And they found that it was important to consider the guild, the functional group that the bee was in. So they found twig nesting bees were differentially impacted versus ground nesting bees, and that large bees and small bees also were differently impacted by the size of the fragment. Something similar was found with this more recent study, also in a desert environment, and they look specifically at the nesting dynamics. And this is so interesting and not something I would have really thought about. But what they found is, in a small fragment, a tiny little piece, the bees that were nesting in twigs there did better in the fact that they could quickly go out and get some pollen and come right back. There was less area to go to. They seemed to be more efficient in that way. The downside was that they were more likely to be found by predators and parasites, and their nests had higher rates of parasitization in those cases. So yeah, there's a bit of a balancing act going on here in terms of the habitat and fragment size. Alien species, invasive species may also impact these and be good in the case of the generalist bees, which really don't care and could visit any of those invasive species that actually provide some connectivity between these different fragments of natural habitat. But on the other hand, we have these specialist bees, and if that's not the plant that's connecting habitat, they may be more impacted. And so we can sum that up here and say, again, with the winners and losers, it's just, this is how it is. The things that we think might be more affected and that maybe should be the focus of our attentions are things like specialists and large bees, which see the landscape differently, right? So a very small, little tiny sweat bee or something to that extent perceives the landscape on a much different scale than something like a carpenter bee, which probably requires resources from further away and may recognize habitat fragmentation at a different scale than our smaller bees. Okay, so what do we do about all of this? I'm open to your ideas, and if we open up the chat here at the end, we can talk through some of the potential steps. Much of this is out of the hands of the backyard gardener. Some of these things like wildfires, your efforts might be best directed towards trying to encourage land managers to make the right decisions at public meetings that happen. But overall, the general idea when you have winners and losers is, of course, to even the playing field. So minimizing habitat fragmentation is totally within the realm of possibility for backyard gardeners. We can minimize habitat fragmentation by creating habitat in our yards that connects on a larger scale. It needs to include diverse plants that attract both specialists and generalists. It needs to include things that bloom all season long. That can be really important. But changing how a bee can perceive habitat might be very important over the long term, not just within a season, but setting them up for that ability to sort of move naturally around a landscape as they normally would. Minimizing pesticide use, erring on the side of caution here really doesn't seem like a bad idea to me. There's still a lot to learn here. We know there's going to be winners and losers, and that, maybe some pesticides aren't as bad as others, but until we have those answers, it might be best to err on the side of caution and support companies, of course, who do the same to make a larger statement. Encouraging public lands to consider pollinators in land management decisions can be a really big deal. They're coming to the forefront now. For a long time, pollinators and insects in general were sort of, you don't even need a permit to go collect insects on most BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land. But helping make it apparent that the public that's using those lands finds those pollinators important can be helpful moving forward, because they can incorporate them into their strategic plans and things like that, especially when it comes to following large burns and maybe how to restore that landscape afterwards with plantings of native shrubs, maybe with a focus not only on stabilizing the soil and all of that sort of thing with grasses, but also including forbs that bees can visit. And then prioritizing preservation of lands that can serve as a refuge to these bees as the climate changes. Maybe, higher elevation places where bees might end up, as in the case in New Hampshire, where now things are more at higher elevations, might be ways that we could mitigate to some extent, or at least buffer against some of the more severe consequences of climate change. And I would argue finally, and this isn't really something that I know how to put up here with a picture and words, but any time we can get a vast number of humans that are passionate and excited and interested and knowledgeable about something, we stand a better shot of being able to help those creatures. So the fact that you all have showed up today to learn more about bees, to truly understand them, and to gain as much information as you can speaks well to the future for our bees. And anything we can do to continue that education and to promote it and spread it out among as many people as possible, I think the better our chances to be able to help bees with all of these things. I put up here if you want to reach me, and I know Denise will make sure that you know how to reach me if you need to later, but feel free to reach out. Joe and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have after this presentation is over. We're always excited to talk to people about bees. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then Denise, maybe you can help with some questions here. I see some chat and some questions showing up.
Super. Yeah. Thanks so much, Olivia. What a great kind of a whirlwind tour of recent literature with wild bees. I did my best to capture all those papers and links, and have so far gotten as many as I was sure I could get up on our course webpage. So I'll make sure they're all up there. It's one of the things I really appreciate about Olivia. When we have conversations, she'll refer to recent papers and the science of it, and really kind of, looking back to that foundation, and not just assumptions that we have, ideas that we have, but really what is the science saying. Bee researchers are really amazing. And once you dig into some of the things that they do, the questions that they ask, and the strategies they use to answer those questions, it's really, really fascinating.
Some pretty creative ways to go about answering some of these questions too. I'm blown away every time I read something new.
Absolutely. So Jamie Strange is on with us, and he jumped in and answered one of the questions about the big-headed males. Mary asked, do the big-headed males father just big-headed sons?
Great answer. That's exactly right. Yep, the big-headed trait comes from the mothers. And what's interesting about it is it appears to be in some way related to how much food they eat. So how much pollen is left in the little cell there for the offspring seems to impact the size of the head and which morph you end up with. As some species are in decline, are the kleptoparasites that prey on them also in decline, or have they changed their host range species? To my knowledge, I don't know if this has been looked at yet. I should double check that to be sure that no one has, but let's see. So most kleptoparasites are specialists at the level of either the genus or in some cases the family of bees that they visit. So the chances that they would be stuck to a particular species, and if that species goes away, they also would, seems a little tenuous. Chances are good that they could parasitize any number that's there. But I don't know of any examples for sure. That's a hypothesis at this point. I'm not really positive, Bob. Good question. My neighbors use a leaf blower to scrub their tree understory of all leaves and debris. What would you say to convince them to stop to help the bees? I would invite them over for a cup of coffee and ask them to look at the bees on your flowers with you and get them excited about them, and then show them the bees nesting under the leaves in your yard. I would start with a fun conversation. That might be the best way to go there. The change in specialist and larger bees that do not travel far, is that a result of change in flower availability? So with the specialist bees, I do think that it has something to do with available resources. This one's a conundrum to me because I also see some specialist bees that appear to persist in like urban environments with no trouble. It might be more nuanced than just all specialist bees together. But some certainly, if the flowering plant is gone, in the case of some of your beautiful Duphoria out there, if their flowering plant is gone, they're not going to be able to persist in that area. With the larger bees, I go back and forth on this. One of the things that occurs to me is that the larger bees may be able to get a better sense of habitat quality and leave. they have that ability. Why not head off, find another spot where you're less likely to be impacted by habitat fragmentation? You know, it's totally possible bees come up in a given year. Flowering resources aren't quite what they want for that particular place. It could be because it's a dry year out here in our deserts, or maybe it's because someone didn't plant anything for them. Large bees can leave. The small bees, small generalists might have to stay put a little more. But the other part of that is that large bees may also be more impacted just because they require larger habitats. And so the fact that the habitat for a large bee is more likely to become fragmented could mean that they didn't leave, they actually weren't able to persist. So I'm not sure which one it is there. And again, it might differ depending on the bee. Carpenter bees, you might notice, don't seem to be impacted at all by any sort of fragmentation. They welcome the houses and all of the wood that comes with them. So I'm not really sure. Does the varroa mite host on other bee species beside Apis mellifera? No, I don't think so. I think varroa, does varroa go to other things? I don't think so. I'm pretty sure it's only on varroa. If a beekeeper doesn't treat for varroa, they're going to die. Do you disagree? Frankly, this is out of my realm of expertise, so I can't say for sure. I do know, and it might be worth checking out. Denise, maybe, I think it's a free paper, so you could post it. It's called Darwinian Beekeeping, and it's by our good friend Tom Seeley. And he talks about how we may be able to create stronger bees by allowing them to experience varroa mite. And the stronger, obviously this would require multiple colonies to pull off, but the bees that are able to go through the natural selection process and learn how to tolerate and kick out those varroa mites are the ones that over time might be more likely to do well in the future. Have there been any studies looking if there's a correlation between expansion of non-native invasive flowering plants and decline of certain bee species? I was wondering if native bees that evolved with native pollen sources suffer nutritional deficiencies. You want to become a scientist? Tommy, maybe you are a scientist. This needs answering. So many answers to this. Where to begin? Some non-native invasive flowering plants seem to have enough nutritional value to sustain bees for the last 20 years. I've had them in my plots. I've seen no change in the bees whatsoever. They're very popular with bees. Bees seem to like them, sometimes preferentially over some of the native plants. And so the bees seem to be doing fine. Now, a more interesting question might be to look and see if some of those native plants have declined in abundance as the bees have switched to this awesome new pollen resource. That might be one of the things that makes those non-native invasive flowering plants so successful, is that the bees perceive them as in some way superior, and they set more seeds that way. That being said, there are some plants out here. We have something called tamarisk, salt cedar, I think is another common name. And I believe that the pollen isn't that great on that. And whether bees are kind of filling their nest with fluff, sort of the Wonder Bread of the 1980s, and whether that's impacting the bees, I don't know. I don't know if it is. It would be interesting to find out, and it is definitely something worth looking into.
Olivia, I'm going to hop in for just a second, just because we're just a few after 11. And folks, I want to invite you to put a thank you into the chat pod for Olivia. She's always wonderful. Olivia, do you have a few minutes to hang on to answer more questions? Okay, so we'll do that. So folks, I know your schedule may be that you need to hop off. We'll keep recording so you can come back and watch the recording of more questions. And Olivia, thank you. If you can tell that Olivia Zooms with her students, so she's very comfortable with the Q&A and the chat box, and she's been rolling through some of those questions. Olivia, there were a couple people who asked about the pink flower with the long corolla.
Yes, let me get the spelling of it right here. I get it wrong almost every time. It's hold on. Oh, got it. Hold on. Diascia. D-I-A-S-C-I-A. Diascia. Isn't it beautiful? Twin spur, I think, common name, twin spur. Let's see. Okay, so more questions here. Did nosema cause decline, or did bee get nosema because of declining health? You're talking about the is this with the honeybees? You're thinking here, Vicki, about the honeybees? I think there was this thing that happened where it made its way slowly around the world and reached our bees a little later. And when it did, we started to see that drop. But there's some thought that some of that, some of the reason that they were so impacted by those pathogens had to do with the fact that they were in declining health already. So they were already weakened. Kind of like I'm more susceptible and going to get a cold more likely if I haven't been sleeping well. Similar sort of thing. So I think it's something like that, but I'm not really sure how long ago that happened or what the final verdict is there. Any suggestions for a watershed approach to helping bees in the Midwest? Any strategy recommendations would be appreciated. A watershed approach to helping bees in the Midwest. You know, if it were up to me, if I were queen of the world and got to pick these things, I think the first thing and my focus would be on creating connected habitat corridors throughout that include native plants. If you're looking at a larger scale, to me, including those native plants in a connected sort of habitat, watching out for invasive plants and trying to minimize those as much as possible, to me seems like the most helpful thing, not just for your endangered bumblebees, but for other bees as well. What non-native plants are natives attracted to in my yard? Well, so I'm in New Mexico, Jillian. If you want to know about the ones out here that they're attracted to, the list is quite long, but includes things like we have a plant called Mellilotus. It's a sweet clover, and the bees love it. They absolutely love it. I'm always guaranteed to find bees. We also have something called Salsola, the common name. Hold on, it was part of the Dust Bowl. What's the common name for Salsola? Hang on. It's a big deal. Just a sec. Russian sage. I'm terrible at common names. Russian thistle. Russian thistle is really attractive with the small little perdita and mining bees that we have out here. It's a terrible invasive plant, but the bees seem to really love it. Always annoying when that happens. Probably out there, it's different. And maybe Denise knows of some of the non-natives that are super attractive with your native bees that are worth thinking about. Let's see. When
Olivia, Kathy suggests that you should be queen of the world, which there was a nice agreement on that one. And a couple folks asked if you could give a quick overview of your new book.
Oh, yeah. If you go to the Princeton University Press website, you can actually see a picture of the cover. They finally have the cover designed. They tell me it's coming out in May of 2021. We'll see if that actually happens. I don't know how good they are at sticking to those things, but my guess is that it will be sometime around May or June. It's supposed to be smaller than our last one. It's supposed to be something that you could actually take out with you. And it was a little daunting to write just because there's so many bees in the East, but we took a stab at finding what we thought were some of the most common and most identifiable ones out there that people would have a chance at really understanding. And so we took those and we took pictures of them up close and found all of the identifying features. And it's a field guide. So it's like an actual field guide, more similar to like a bird guide with pointers at the different parts that are important on the body that will help you identify to the species level some of the bees that we find. Does that help? Does that answer the question? So it has maps, it has all of those things, but it's more at the level of the species. Bob, your thing popped up. Here's my necklace. Isn't that pretty? A friend gave it to me. I have no idea what it is. I think it's a bunch of pieces of glass, but it always makes me happy to wear. So there it is. Let's see. I'm also interested in her question. While trying to attract bees to a garden, are there any plants that should not be planted? Not be planted. So if it was a choice between planting something that was not native and not planting at all, I suppose I would plant a not native before I would leave it barren. Some nectar source, something is better than nothing. If there was something that I wouldn't plant, it would be those sort of real showy roses and echinaceas and things like that that are gorgeous to look at but provide absolutely no anything of nutritional value to a bee. So very little nectar, probably very little pollen, really hard to maneuver in, all of those things. If there was something not to plant, to me, it would be that, because you might as well, from a bee's point of view, you haven't planted anything. It's not useful to them in any way. So avoid those. I guess you could avoid grasses. I don't know. Grasses maybe are something the bees aren't attracted to either. But beyond that, if you really want to, you have some amazing non-native plant that you want to put in. I'm not going to hold it against you. It's okay. It's totally okay. Lots of pretty perennials being produced. Went to a library talk given by a large producer, and every plant she brought was sterile. If a plant is sterile, like so many so-called proven winners, does that also mean it does not produce pollen? I am not sure what the nursery definition of a sterile plant is, but in general, it means one that can't set seed. The question is whether it can't set seed because it doesn't have pollen, because the ovary is not receptive, or because the seed itself is unable to germinate. And I'm not sure which of those she was referring to when she said the plant was sterile. If it's something about the, well, so let's think about this. In our gardens, right, quite often some of the tomatoes and things that you buy that aren't heirloom are sterile, and the flowers that they produce still have pollen that seems to be very useful to the bees, at least where I am. So I would wonder if it's not the seed that's the part that's sterile. Not sure there, but might be worth looking into. Someone didn't like that I said it's true. Grasses are definitely good for birds and are habitat for other insects as well. Totally thinking very bee-centric here. It's okay to plant grasses. I have several in my yard if you want to know the truth. This is just more of a comment than a question. I hate lawns in general, and my dream is when I get a house, the lawn will be converted to a prairie or native garden. And once that's established, I want to use it as a learning tool to identify insects and use the Nature's Notebook. Bravo, that's a great idea, to determine what species are visiting the garden and when. I know there will be challenges depending on city restrictions. There's always going to be challenges. You're probably going to plant in a really wet or dry year, and it's going to be challenging to get started. But that is a great goal. It's something I encourage many people to do. There is nothing as satisfying as putting something out and finding animals visiting it. It's just so fun to find this new way to connect with nature. You know, we often think as humans that we are separate from that natural world, and our gardens are one way to remind us that we are connected in a different way perhaps, but we are connected. And seeing those things out there is incredibly rewarding. Anytime that you see stuff like that and you can post it to a website like iNaturalist, the Great Sunflower Project, something like that, it benefits more than just you. The information and the presence of the bees and birds and other insects that you see there is information that everybody would love to know about. So spread the love, spread the joy about those things that you find when you're out looking for bees and birds and butterflies and beetles. When bees indicate a preference for species of non-native plants, can we assume that they know the nutrients are sufficient? No, I don't believe we can assume that. I don't think that any more than we could say that about my small children and their love of popsicles. It doesn't mean necessarily that the plant has good pollen because the bee has chosen to collect from it. And the only thing I can think of to sort of back that up is a study that was done a little while ago now by someone. Ty Rolston was at least one of the people that was on it. And he actually swapped out bits of pollen and gave them pollen with different nutritive values to see what that did to the development of the larva. And it did affect how the larva grew and how big they got and all of those things. More than that, the larvae were just fine eating it. They had no problem eating something that was supposedly of less nutritional value. So I would say that we can't necessarily make that assumption. What was the name of the bee who can choose to stay in the nest an additional year? There's actually many that can. But the one that has been best researched is called Macrotera portalis. If you want, I can type that name here into the chat. Let's see. Oh, hold on. All panelists and attendees. Macrotera portalis. I just put that in the chat so you can see it there. That one has been fairly well studied, but there are some other bees that have also been looked at and found to be able to do the same thing. Let's see. Let's see, that one's been answered. Invasives. Are there any studies looking into the more recent impact of the soybean herbicide, which drifts appears nearly uncontrollable? When I was looking over the last few days, I did not come across anything that talked about that herbicide in particular. That doesn't mean that it's not out there, but I am unaware of those studies that have looked at that yet. Most of the plants let's see, we did that one. Hang on. Moving up. Opened up by Trump to logging. Yes. Definitely not a helpful thing for anything. There's mixed reviews on what logging does for our bees. In some ways, it sort of opens up an opening in a canopy that otherwise wouldn't have been there and can attract flowers and stuff. On the other hand, it can lead to increased slash, which changes how the wildfires go when they come through there. So it can be problematic. I've heard that many fungicides have a synergistic effect when used with pesticides that can be more detrimental. Absolutely, Anthony, that's what I'm reading as well. So the fungicide is detrimental. Also the pesticide is detrimental. And when you put the two together, it's this sort of synergistic, exponentially detrimental effect. Yes, for sure. Have there been any studies looking if there is a correlation between expansion of non-native invasive flowering plants and decline of certain, if native bees that evolved with native plants or suffer any? I don't know. We don't know that one. I think I almost answered something like that. So let's see. What have I missed? Denise, am I missing any?
I don't think so. I think we're doing great. I think we need to mention the National Pollinator Week next year, 2021. Jenny Pope, I don't know if Jenny's still on, but Jenny, who's our wonderful colleague at Franklin Park Conservatory, has invited Olivia to come for Pollinator Week. Hopefully we'll all be able to meet in person, see each other, go out in the beautiful gardens there at Franklin Park and hunt some bees. So fingers crossed, we'll be doing more 3D engagement next year versus the 2D Zoom webinars. But Olivia, it's been wonderful. Thanks so much for hanging around and answering. We had a lot of really great questions, and I know people love to get to all their questions. So looking forward to the new book. And Olivia and I are putting a Eastern Bees 101 course together that we hope to launch publicly this winter. So you'll all get news about that when it's ready to launch. You'll learn so much from this wonderful woman. So thanks again, Olivia. Thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate your time this morning. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation. Maybe you'll be a winner tomorrow. And, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Denise. That was fun. Thanks for all your questions, guys.